Hey guys, CJ 3450 and Justice in America. So, by the way, I just had a Zoom meeting with my colleagues and they were talking about the ceiling being so close to my head. It's actually not, just so you know, in case you were wondering. This is actually my upstairs in my house, and it's going to be my Airbnb unit, assuming Airbnb is ever a thing again. But what I did was decorate it with pictures from world travel. It's kind of comfortable. I love it up there. It's got a big TV, two bedrooms, bathroom, but I come up here to work right now. So that's what you're looking at, just so you know. And good advice, right, Professor? Okay, so today we're going to move into chapter 6. Now, here's the thing. Chapter 6 is pretty short, and it deals with police, courts, and corrections. But um, I'm going to supplement what you're going to read with PowerPoint notes, which are really important, and also some additional readings related to specific topics that you really need to understand coming up for your final exam. Okay. All of this, keep in mind, police, courts, corrections in this chapter is going to illustrate with data, with numbers, some of the arguments of the class, in particular the argument about innocent bias. And so, what does innocent bias look like when you look at police, courts, and corrections? Remember, innocent bias is a bias or disparity or a difference or discrimination that comes from the law itself. It's called innocent because it's not intended by agents of policing or courts or corrections. It just happens because they're carrying out bias law. And the way we define bias law in the class was law that doesn't define the things that are most dangerous to us as crimes or serious crimes, or that focuses on certain types of acts while ignoring others, right? So we'll see this when we first get into policing. The policing stuff you need to understand is easier to understand if you've taken a policing class or if you've taken an intro class. It's not required that you've done that, but if you're having any trouble with any of this information, Google it, get an intro book, get a policing book, that kind of thing, just to flesh out some of the basics, okay? But you should be able to understand everything based on what I talk about, based on the PowerPoint slideshow, and based on what's in your book. Okay, so we start off with the basics. First of all, there's police agencies at every level of government. We have federal police agencies, state police agencies, local police agencies, and then there's even specialized agencies, say Appalachian State University Police Department, right? And then some states like Texas has their own unique things like the Texas Constables. But a federal agency would be the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A state agency would be State Highway Patrol, for example, in North Carolina. A local agency, Boone PD, or Watauga County Sheriff's Department, right? Boone PD has jurisdiction or authority over the city, and Watauga County sheriffs have jurisdiction over the county, and Highway Patrol has authority over the highway. So King Street, by the way, is a highway, 421. It's also in the town of Boone and in the county. So if a crime happens on King Street, you have maybe 3 agencies responding to that if necessary, if it's serious enough, okay? But the reason I bring this up is that, and you'll see this in your slideshow, bring that up on the basics of American policing, that the allocation of police officers to different government levels determines what police do. In other words, where we hire police, what level of government they work for, determines their focus. Well, you'll see the first thing is that the first key fact is that most police agencies and officers work for a local level of government. Now, there are some data in your slideshow about from 2008, and there are some more recent data, which I'm happy to share if you're interested, but they're difficult to find, and the numbers don't change. That is, the percentages don't change. So what you'll see when you look at the numbers is about 75%, about 3 out of 4 officers work for local police departments and sheriff's offices. That means they work for cities and counties. Okay, so 75%. So when we're talking about the typical cop, we're talking about a local police officer. You'll see also a list of federal agencies that hire police as well if you're interested in your PowerPoint slideshow. But since most police work for local levels of government, that means your typical police officer is focused on the things that local police departments focus on. And what they generally focus on is street crime, not white collar crime, not corporate crime, not government deviance or what's called state corporate crime, where states, governments encourage or enable corporations to commit crimes. That's a little bit beyond our class. You'll learn about that in a white collar or corporate crime class, for example. But the point is, local police departments are generally focused on street crime. Now, why is that a problem? You'll see when you look at the slide titled Focus of American Police, that offenders can be individuals or groups, and victims can be individuals or groups. Generally speaking, policing, for the most part in the United States, is focused on when one individual harms another. So murder, rape, robbery, theft, these kinds of things, that's when the police respond, right? If an individual hurts a lot of people, or if a group of people harm others, then that's going to be the jurisdiction of state or federal agency, so terrorism or something like that, right? But when a group or organization commits a harmful act against an individual or others, this is generally not the province of police, unless it's explicitly illegal, like terrorism, for example. Otherwise, these white-collar and corporate crimes, or these forms of elite deviance, including some that are legal, are handled by regulatory agencies or civil agencies. In other words, like you can sue a corporation for manufacturing a defective product, but no one gets arrested. Or a corporation can get in trouble with a regulatory agency if it violates some kind of safety standard where workers are injured, but no one gets arrested or convicted or incarcerated even when people die. This is why it's called innocent bias. The agencies are simply enforcing the law itself, and the law is where the bias comes from. Okay, so basically, the first major point is most police departments and most police officers work for local government, and therefore they focus on street crime. Okay, we'll get back to that when we look at innocent bias in policing. The next key point you'll see in the chapter and in your slideshow is how police officers are supposed to behave. And there's 5 basic roles of law enforcement or policing that come from the so-called Law Enforcement Code of Conduct. Now, this is a document that I'll place on your As You Learn page. It's typically a handout that I hand out in class, but since we're not there and I don't have access to my work computer and I'm not allowed to go to my office to get it, we're banned from campus if you didn't know. I'm going to find as close approximity to that document as I can and put it As You Learn. Now, if you take a policing class or if you take an intro class, you may learn a different number of rules. So some people say 3, some people say 4, whatever. But these 5 roles come from that document. So police officers enforce the law, they preserve the peace, they prevent crime, they provide services for people, and they uphold rights. Here's some examples. Enforcing the law is responding to a call, making an arrest, investigating a crime, just carrying out the law. Preserving the peace would be intervening in conduct like at a football game or on the road or a concert where people are being rowdy just to make sure things are peaceful. Okay, breaking up a party. Preventing crime is simply being present in a place, patrols, so that criminals don't do crime there. DARE, even though DARE is not considered effective, drug abuse resistance education in school is aimed at crime prevention, right? Services are anything from like your car breaks down or you lock your keys in your car, or you lose your child or your grandparent or your dog or whatever and you call the police. They're there to help provide services. They also, when they respond to a crime, they will provide a service in the sense of giving you, let's say a domestic violence incident, they will give advice to people and maybe even hand a card for a counselor that you may seek out. These are services that police officers provide. Upholding rights is just think about Miranda rights. They read your Miranda warning when arrest is imminent, reminding you that you have the right not to incriminate yourself, that you have a right to an attorney. This is protecting your rights because even though they want to get the bad guy, so to speak, they also want to make sure they do it legally as required by the Constitution. So these are 5 roles. Now, the typical police officer in the United States spends most of their time not actually dealing with crime, which might surprise you if you watch TV, right? If you watch police shows. Most police officers spend the vast majority of their time providing services to people and being involved in routine administrative tasks like paperwork and reports and things like that. The number of crimes that officers respond to depends on the jurisdiction, depends on the city size and that sort of thing. But on average, if a police officer works a 10-hour shift, they're going to get 10 calls for service. Only 1 or 2 of those is going to deal with crime. Most of those are cold crimes where the offender is already gone from the scene. So they have to do an investigation. Okay. So if you take ride-alongs, you'll see how boring policing can be. There's also something called the roller coaster syndrome, where you have sheer intense moments of terror followed by long periods of boredom. This is the reality of policing. So I encourage you to take some ride-alongs if you haven't already done so. Now, having said that, we still expect police to serve crime victims in lots of ways. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the way we do policing is it's incident-driven, which means police wait. It's reactive. They wait for the crime to occur, and then they get called. And they respond. Problem-oriented policing, on the other hand, is identifying problems in the community with the help of the community as a form of community policing, and solving those problems before they become crime. So let's say neighbors in a neighborhood, people in the neighborhood complain to the police about cut-through traffic or people speeding really fast, and they're getting angry. This might lead to a crime against a driver. Police can work with the community to put up signs, barriers, speed bumps, speed humps. They could practice public awareness to let people know to slow down or not cut through these neighborhoods. And then you solve the problem of crime before it happens. Okay? But the fact that policing is largely incident-driven, meaning reactive after the fact, this is why police have so little effect on the crime rate, according to studies. So you look at studies online, the effect of police on crime rate is considered moderate to small. So don't expect police to solve a lot of crime in the sense of making it go down. They'll solve it in terms of making arrests, but it's largely ineffective at actually reducing crime. Let me get some of my hot tea here in my throat. All right, the next point, excuse me, is that police are expected to behave in a certain way, according to this law enforcement code of conduct. So again, when you read this, I want you to look for keywords in this document, and then you can compare those keywords like impartial, fair, just, proper use of discretion and these sort of things. I'll provide you with some real life experiences in the form of links in your PowerPoint presentation where you can compare the idea that police are supposed to be neutral and biased and fair with some of the realities of policing in terms of some of the disparities we see in terms of who's most likely to be stopped, detained, questioned, have force used against them, excessive force used against them, lethal force used against them, or even just being arrested. So these disparities call into question the idea of whether the law enforcement code of conduct is being met. Now I argue, and this is the idealist in me, I argue in your PowerPoint slideshow and in my classes that I believe the vast majority of police officers in the United States do their best to follow these mandates of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police is the organization that creates the law enforcement code of conduct. But there are some structural impediments that make policing more difficult, or that would reduce the likelihood that police will be able to meet this really high standard for their behavior. First of all, less than 1% of police departments require a college degree. The average starting salary is around $40,000. The average starting salary. So you're talking about people who don't have advanced education, who make very little money, and we have these really, really high expectations for their behavior. I think that's unreasonable. I have a plan to double the salary of every police officer in the United States and to double the salary of every teacher in the United States. That money comes from taxes, of course, but in this case, we wouldn't actually even have to raise taxes. We just have to not spend it on other things. But of course, that's a matter of opinion, and that's a matter of our own personal priorities and preferences. If you want to know about that, send me an email and I'll send you some data on it, just out of curiosity, okay? But my argument is, what can we reasonably expect from police who are held to such a high standard when they're paid so little and we don't expect them to have a higher education? Now, here's the main point of the chapter when it comes to policing. So this is kind of the key point of everything. Even if every police officer in the United States followed these mandates, followed these guidelines of the law enforcement code of conduct, we'd still have bias in policing. We still have a problem. So in other words, we had no racist cops, no discriminatory cops. Everyone's dedicated to fairness and properly using discretion. We still have a problem, and that's because if the law is biased, policing would be biased since they're enforcing that law. So remember, that's what innocent bias is, right? Now, I'll go through 5 sources of innocent bias that are discussed in your chapter to some degree, and you'll see some additional readings embedded in your PowerPoint slideshow on these as well, so make sure you check those out. If any of these links don't work, let me know. You can also do some searching on your own about these topics as well. But basically, where innocent bias comes from is 5 places. The first is our focus on street crime. So remember that street crime are acts that are generally or disproportionately committed by powerless people. Poor people, people of color, minorities, right? Middle class people do them, yes. Wealthy people do them also, but just less so, right? They have less reason to. So since street criminals are more likely to be arrested than white collar and corporate criminals, logically, if police are arresting street criminals, they're going to be arresting the people who commit them. That is poor people and people of color who are disproportionately doing it. So one source of innocent bias is just the law itself saying that police should focus on these acts as opposed to others. The second source of innocent bias identified in the chapter is where police are located. So you'll see if you look at the research, we put more police officers in large cities where there's more crime, in inner city areas, there's more crime, neighborhoods with high levels of poverty, and neighborhoods with high levels of minority residents or people of color. Okay. Now, that's appropriate if it's only in response to crime. If it's in response to the actual presence of minorities or people of color, then we have what's called the social threat or minority threat hypothesis. This is simply putting more police officers in areas because of more fear associated with a higher level of minorities in that neighborhood. I encourage you to search these terms. If you know how to use the databases in the library, for example, you can look up minority threat in sociological journals or criminal justice journals, and you'll see a lot of evidence that it's true. Now, it's not true everywhere. We don't find it everywhere, but criminologists find it some places. That's consistent with what we talked about in class called contextual discrimination. Discrimination in some contexts, some places, but not others, right? So in some police departments, we have evidence of the social threat or minority threat hypothesis. So innocent bias comes from focusing on certain crimes. It also comes on focusing on certain places, and then it comes from focusing on certain people, which we'll get to in a minute. But it's key to point out the third source is just discretion itself. Discretion is defined as the ability of an officer to act according to their own professional judgment. So we give police officers discretion for good reason. You get pulled over, you don't necessarily have to get a ticket, right? If police can cut you a break, it makes you feel better about law enforcement. It doesn't escalate the situation, doesn't lead to violence, this sort of thing. And I know that if you've ever been pulled over and not given a ticket, you appreciate this kind of discretion. But if race and social class are used as warning signs, then that means who police pull over is partially determined by who they fear. And who they fear is partially determined by the law, based on what it defines as crime and serious crime, but also based on images in the media of people that we all watch. So if police are more afraid of people of color, for example, if they're more afraid of poor people, they're more likely to pull them over, stop them, question them, search them, and this can lead to all kinds of disparities in policing, like arrests and use of force. Now, there's a slide about your typical criminal in your PowerPoint slideshow, and since these people don't have names, you might not know all of them. You'll recognize some of them, like Kobe Bryant and O.J. Simpson. These are all cases that made the news. You might recognize Trayvon Martin as well. These are all cases that made the news where either an African American had allegedly committed a crime or was wrongly accused of a crime by a white person. Those are called racial hoaxes in the book, racial hoaxes. So you can check that out. But the point is, the media depict, as we talked about already in the class, people of color as being more dangerous. So this affects not only us, but it also affects police officers logically. And then you add on to that the fact that they're working in these communities and they're interacting with folks that they may be more afraid of based on their actual behavior, what they see. And so we'd expect that maybe another source of innocent bias would be racial profiling. So that's the fourth source. So profiling doesn't just happen with race, and it doesn't just occur with police officers. Profiling occurs when any of us use race or class or any factor outside of the law, so-called extra legal factors, factors outside the law, to identify someone as a potential suspect. Well, we know racial profiling exists. We know where it exists. We even know why it exists. But we also know it doesn't exist everywhere. So when researchers look for it, they don't find it everywhere. That's, again, consistent with contextual bias or discrimination. But look, if people of color are more likely to be stopped by the police, questioned by the police, searched, have their car searched, but only slightly more likely to be arrested, that's what the national data show. See that in your book. That means they're not actually committing more crime, or not vastly committing more crime, and yet they're being stopped, searched, harassed. This is consistent with profiling. And then you'll see the states where it's verified in your book, in your book as well, but also in PowerPoint slideshow. And then you'll notice it kind of correlates if you pull up the notes. There are places where it's not found, for example, or hasn't been found widely in states. It's possibly because it's not illegal in those states, so they're not looking for it. That's one possible explanation for it. So I'm providing you some readings embedded in your PowerPoint slideshow about profiling. You can check those out. Just some of it's from North Carolina and some of it's from all over the country, just to see what it looks like. So flip through those readings. They're really interesting. And you'll see how profiling occurs and what it looks like in the United States. Finally, the last source of innocent bias that's identified in the book, and this goes back to Michelle Alexander's argument, if you remember from earlier in the class, where she talked about a racial caste system. Even if she's wrong, she's correct that the war on drugs makes a huge part of innocent bias. So you'll see the data on the slide in your PowerPoint slideshow. African Americans make up about 12% of the population, about 13% of drug users. But they make up 35% of people arrested for drugs, 44% of people convicted for drugs in state courts, and 45% of inmates in state prisons for drug crimes. So what does that mean? It means people of color and African Americans in particular are overrepresented among people getting arrested and convicted and incarcerated for drugs, even though they're not using more drugs. So something else explains that. So there's this great study from the city of Seattle that's discussed in your book and also in the PowerPoint slideshow that really helps us understand this. So to the credit of the police department in Seattle, they were willing to share data with researchers about this alleged problem in their city where Black people were getting arrested. African Americans were being arrested way more than anybody else for drugs, even though the only drugs that Blacks were dealing as a majority of dealers was cocaine. So those dealing meth, ecstasy, powder cocaine, heroin were white people, but police were arresting a lot of Black people. So researchers wanted to know why, and the city of Seattle agreed to share the data with them. And what the researchers found was 3 reasons why police were not focused on necessarily, but were arresting African Americans more than whites. Number 1, they're focused on crack. So there's this perception from the media that crack's more dangerous, even though it's not. It's the same drug as cocaine, just used in a different form. The crack markets were once very violent, like we talked about in class in the 1980s. This is no longer the case. But there's this perception in law enforcement that crack is more dangerous. So if you focus on crack, regardless of race, if you're not even thinking about race, you're gonna be arresting the people who deal it, well, they happen to be disproportionately Black. Okay. Number 2, the police were focused on outdoor drug activity, which makes sense. If you're dealing drugs in a town square or in a public park or outside of a school or what have you, outside of a nightclub, of course you're more likely to be arrested. It's easier. Well, African Americans were disproportionately involved in outdoor drug activity. Okay. So these first 2 reasons are sort of race neutral. Focusing on a certain drug and focusing on a certain place ends up leading to more arrests of African Americans because that's the drugs they're dealing, and that's where they're dealing. Okay, but the third one explicitly identifies race, where the more racially diverse areas of drug activity receive more detention. So police were also affected by the racial threat or minority threat hypothesis, where they're not only looking for crack and outdoor activity, but they're looking for places where blacks and Latinos are dealing, for example. So that's where race comes in explicitly. So race is affecting these data directly, but also indirectly by focusing on these people's drugs and the way they deal them outdoors. Okay. Now you'll also see the example in your chapter that's not discussed in PowerPoint about City of New York. This is the famous stop and frisk case that we talked about. So just take a look at those data. Blacks and Latinos in New York City made up about 60% of the population, but about 90% of the people being stopped and frisked. Pretty outlandish stuff. So the Federal Appeals Court ruled the practice unconstitutional because it was discriminatory, okay, a violation of the 14th Amendment. So check that out as well. But here's the outcomes of this in policing. Certain people are more likely to be stopped, they're more likely to be detained, questioned, harassed, however you want to see it. They're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be subjected to force, including excessive force, including lethal force. So there's data in the book about who gets killed by the police with shootings and that sort of thing, and it's disproportionately people of color. Part of that is this innocent bias. Well, that matters for those people. It matters for us if we're interested in equality and justice. But it also matters for the police. And this is why police perhaps take it quite seriously. People who are subjected to this discriminatory outcomes, or these disparities, if you will, have less favorable views of the police. They're less likely to assist the police. They're less likely to cooperate with the police. And so these disparities actually harm policing as well. So that's why I think one of the reasons police departments take this quite seriously and do not want disparities or racial discrimination in their departments. They're they're working really hard to seek out people who will be good police officers and get them in the police academy and provide them with the tools necessary to make sure that these outcomes don't happen. That's what we're working on as a country. All right. That's a quick rundown of innocent bias in policing. The next video that I'll make later in the week will deal with courts, and we'll carry that on to corrections. Just keep in mind to do the additional readings as well. Some of those will be embedded in your PowerPoint slideshow, and some will be on your As You Learn page. All of this is meant to sort of supplement and flush out and make explicit, and easier to understand the material that we're talking about together, okay? Let me know if you have any questions. Email me, message me. If you want to do a Zoom session as well with me, I'm happy to do that as well. Just let me know. And you guys keep safe, and I'll see you soon.